Welcome to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires, the show where we talk about finding strength when life falls apart. I'm your host, Melie, and around here, resilience isn't perfection. It's falling flat, getting back up, and maybe laughing about it later. From breakups to breakthroughs, we mix faith, neuroscience, and a little sass to help you rebuild a life that actually feels like yours. Are you ready? Let's go. Welcome back to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires, the podcast where we look for light in life's messiest moments. Today's episode is Sacred Ground. I'm honored to be joined today by author and pastor April Yamasaki, whose latest book, Hope Beyond Our Sorrows, was born from the greatest heartbreak of her life, the sudden death of her beloved husband, known in her writing as Dearheart. After nearly 45 years of marriage, April found herself walking through a grief she could never have imagined. But even in the shadow of that loss, she discovered glimmers of grace, evidence that God had not abandoned her even when nothing made sense. April is an ordained minister with 25 years of pastoral experience. She now serves as the editor of Rejoice Daily Devotional Magazine and the resident author with a small liturgical worship community. Her writing explores what it means to live with faith and hope, not just in joy, but in suffering too. April, I'm so honored to have you here today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Melie, and thank you for that kind introduction. It's good to talk with you today.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dive in. Your book, Hope Beyond Our Sorrows, was such a deeply personal and a faith-filled work. I really enjoyed reading it. But before we dive in, I wanted to ask you about something that just really touched me as I read. Throughout the book, you refer to your husband as Dearheart, and it's just such a tender, sweet name. I was wondering if you could share the story behind that and what it meant for you.
Well, in our dating years and married life, we had many names for one another. And somehow, when I started writing this story, that's how I started writing it. And I'm not really sure, it wasn't a conscious decision. Okay, now this is how I'm going to do it. But I had written some blog pieces about my grief journey. And the publisher that had published my first two books with them, Herald Press, I had already done a book with them on spiritual practice and another book on self-care. They had a new editor who contacted me, and she said, "We're wondering if you're ready to write another book." And one of her ideas, because she had read my blog post, was to write about my grief journey. And so really that started as a personal reflection and grew out of that. And I started writing Dearheart. And when the manuscript was finished and I had sent it in to my editor, they have a developmental edit first done by a third party. And the developmental editor said she just loved that she said, it's so personal and it's about your relationship, but it is also something that other people can identify with because other people have Dearhearts, whether it's their spouse or their child or whoever it is that they have lost. And she said, she marked, it was in this, I think it was the 5th or 6th chapter, she marked it and she said, finally, we know his name is Gary. And I hadn't even realized it, even though I had written the book. I hadn't thought, I'm only saying his name now in the 5th or the 6th chapter instead of from the beginning. And I said to her, well, I can add that earlier. So then people have more of a context. So it wasn't a conscious decision either. But yeah, Gary has been my Dearheart and still is my Dearheart.
I love that. In your book, you're very honest about the rawness of loss. If you're comfortable sharing this, what do you remember about those early days and weeks after your husband passed?
Well, it was such a sudden loss. He was in the hospital dealing with some complications. We thought it was complications from the chemo that he was doing. And his experience with chemo had been, as it often is with people, kind of up and down. But he would have some days where he would say, I feel so good, I forget that I'm sick. Well, he had this day when it seemed that he was very sick from his most recent treatment. And that persisted. And it became so much more. He was in the hospital for 3 weeks dealing with complication after complication. And he was finally through all of those. The hospitalist at our local hospital here said, you've come through this before, because he had recovered from a previous cancer 6 years earlier. She said, you come through it before, you can come through this again. And they were talking about how now complications were over. It's time for him to get stronger and come home and resume his chemo treatments. So that's what we were all thinking. We had a meeting with his doctor and the specialist and the dietitian, kind of the whole team, on that Saturday morning. And we were talking about how he would get stronger to come home. And he said, I'm tired of hospital food and I would like to have some wonton soup. And they said, great. So I said, wonderful, I'll go and pick it up. So I picked up wonton soup from his favorite place and brought it back to the hospital. But he had one more complication and he died by that evening. So for me, it was like this deep plunge into molasses. I heard later that some people talk about grief like molasses. And as I look back at it, I think that was true of me. I felt like I am submerged now in this molasses. I can't move. I can hardly breathe. And it was like that really for the first days and weeks. And there was so much, it was just kind of people were coming out of COVID at that time in our area. So things were changing, but there was still living with that. And then at the same time, dealing with this deep, deep grief. When my mother had died years earlier, one of the things I learned from my Chinese heritage was to take a time of mourning, a deliberate time. And so when my mother died and I was in full-time ministry, I said to my church, one of the practices of mourning is for someone who has lost a close family member not to go visiting in other people's homes. I think it comes in part from maybe an older superstition that you've now had this bad luck come in your life. You don't bring that bad luck to other people. So other people could come visit me. We could go visit in a restaurant or some other place, but not to go to someone else's home. And so I did that when my mother died for 30 days. That was the tradition of mourning that I learned at that time. And I said, it might come from a place of superstition about not bringing bad luck. But for me, it's more a way of saying that life is now forever changed. And this person's death matters. And so I'm marking that by observing this time. And my church was very understanding in my taking that time. So then when my husband died, I thought, yeah, I need a time of mourning. And arbitrarily, didn't say 30 days, I arbitrarily said, because he died in February, I thought I am going to take this time of mourning until Easter. And for me, that meant giving myself a lot of grace. I had actually, shortly before he died, I had signed a book contract and he had encouraged me to sign it. After all, he was in the hospital then, but he was clearly getting better. And he said, people need to hear your voice. You go ahead and sign that. So I had the book contract and I thought, yeah, now I can't write it. It was to be a book of sermons. So I just gave myself grace, talked to my publisher, and thought, okay, between now and Easter, and I'm not saying by Easter my world will feel right again, but I'm going to give myself at least that time to give grace, to not write, to not run around visiting people, to take care of myself. And I think that was an important time of grieving for me. I mean, now when I look back at it, I think, wow. And I also was very selfish in that way because it suddenly became all about me, what I wanted and how I was grieving. And I also began to realize though, hey, I'm not the only one grieving here. We didn't have children, but we had friends, we had family members, we had other people who were also grieving. And so I also, through that time, I think made that movement from me to we to see the bigger picture of grief. But in the beginning, I think I was selfish, and maybe that's a good thing in that early stage of grief when really it takes time for what has happened even to sink in.
And I think one of the hardest parts of grief is those questions that tend to kind of come up. Why did this happen? Why did it happen now? Why did it happen to him? How do you wrestle with those types of questions with God when, there's not necessarily neat answers that will come?
My husband, when he had his first diagnosis with cancer, he never asked why me. And he was convinced that, and he would use this language around it. He said, this is a blip. And in a way it was. He had surgery. He did not need chemo or radiation afterward. It was a success. He recovered well. We went to Hawaii for the first time to celebrate, and we hiked up Diamond Head. And I remember thinking, what a blessing that he has come through this bout with cancer, and here we are now at Diamond Head together. And so for this second recurrence, he didn't say it was a blip, but he was also never asked why me. His view was really that in life things happen to everyone, and we know that from our own experience and from my experience in ministry. And I think because he did not focus on that question, somehow I didn't either. And my questions were more about, how am I going to get through this? How am I going to manage without him? So, again, I think that larger question, I know for some people, those are the bigger questions. Why is this happening and why is this happening now? But it wasn't such a live question for me personally. I know in my ministry, when I've talked with people about that, we look at some of the scriptures that talk about life and some of the struggles that the psalmists have gone through. And we see that there's this common human experience of going through things that we don't understand. And yet coming to the place where we know that God is with us.
Yeah, it is true. We all do end up going through these types of things. And so, how we can kind of prepare ourselves through reading the scriptures and knowing what the psalmists say about it, I think can be very comforting. Now, as you wrote this book, did you find that writing about it was actually part of that healing process for you?
I didn't think about it at that time, but in hindsight, I do think it was. I mean, writing has always been part of how I've processed things in my life, and I've been a pretty much a lifelong journaler. When I was a kid, I would write down some of my thoughts in my little notebooks and some of the phrases that I wanted to remember that other people said. And then in high school and as a young adult, and then as an adult, I would sometimes write pages processing something that happened in my life. And so too, writing was part of healing from my grief in the same way that I process everything else in my life. But writing for publication is also different. So in writing for myself, I could lament and not think about, how is this going to communicate to someone else? And I think that was important for me to have that kind of writing in my journals. And yet, when it came to writing something that would be published, I thought more about the reader. Who will be reading this, and what will they need to hear or to take away? My husband had always been someone who was one of my very first readers of anything I wrote. But for things that were going to be published, I would always check with him if it concerned us or our relationship, or if it was about him, whether it was okay to say this in public. And so I didn't have that now. I couldn't directly ask him and say, well, is it okay if I put it this way?
Yeah.
I mean, he trusted my judgment, so I don't think he would have had a problem at all with anything I've written in the book. But at the same time, because he wasn't there to talk to about it, it also brought that loss even more to the forefront as I was writing.
Yeah, I can imagine in writing for publication, it's probably difficult to decide, what do I share with readers versus what do I just keep between myself and God? So, how do you navigate that now, like as you're writing articles and different things? What are some ways that you decide, like, this is something that I should share, or this is maybe something I should keep between me and God?
I sometimes think about my reader, and I sometimes think about myself. What would I want to read in a book? And I know early on I had been given some books, and one was A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, which is a classic. I had heard about the book before. I'd read others of his books, but I had not read that one. But I read his book. And as I read it, I found myself nodding. Yes, I can resonate with what he's saying about grief here. And in other places, I just shook my head and I thought, no, that's not my experience. And when I finished reading his book, I thought, really, everyone could and maybe should write out their grief story because it's so personal and it's so individual for each of us. I know when I wrote Hope Beyond Our Sorrows, in some ways it's reserved. So I don't talk about a lot of the hospital experience and that side of it. Another writer that I've read recently goes into great detail about the friend that she lost to cancer. And there's a lot of detail about what happened in the hospital and the treatment and so on. And as I read it, I thought this is a very good book, but I can't read these parts. I'm just going to pass over them because they're too much for me right now. Maybe I'll go back and I'll read it at some other point. Maybe I will just let it be and take the other things from the book. And I think people are very different in what they want to read and the questions they ask. I mean, you had asked about, the why me kind of question. And I know that one of my readers had said what he had hoped for in the book was a little bit more on the theological questions. And that was not really what I was writing or my concern. So I maybe touch on that a little bit, but it wasn't, it's not a book of theology on suffering. That needs to be someone else's book that he could read. And the same thing with some of the details. Like for some people, they are really wanting to know some of the things on the medical side. And that's some other book. So I try to think about what kind of book is this going to be and what do I hope for both the reader and for myself as I'm writing it.
How do you suggest for somebody who's listening to this podcast going through something right now? It could be the loss of a spouse, a friend, a parent, or it could be divorce or even just loss of a career, change in identity. How do you begin to navigate overwhelming emotions?
Give yourself grace, give yourself time, and not expect instant answers or an instant solution, and know that that's all right, that the journey, I mean, it really is a grief journey. And I know for some people, one woman whose husband died 15 years ago, she contacted me and she said she's remarried, she has a good life, she is happy with her life, but she says sometimes it feels like his death was yesterday. So there is that sense, and C.S. Lewis talks about that in his book, that he says it's a spiral. Just when you think you've come to a different stage, oh no, you're back there again. And you may wonder, when will this spiral ever end? And maybe it won't exactly end, but it will be transformed over time. And maybe that time between those moments, when you go back to that, maybe that becomes longer. And I think, in practical ways, I mean, that's sort of the answer. Well, what do we do about that in our inner selves and in our self-talk to give ourselves time and to give ourselves grace? But also then to think outwardly, what is it that you need and who is it that you need? And to move toward that as well. And of course, to have that grounding in prayer and just being before God, even if you're not saying anything or not forming words. Like for me, I find that very valuable. But sometimes it means calling one of my sisters or calling a friend. Sometimes it means just lying on the couch and listening to one of the songs from my husband's collection of 1980s music or whatever it is that helps you kind of get away from your spiraling thoughts. Going outside, I love to be in the garden and just kind of putter around there. So that helps me. I also love crossword puzzles, and that also helps me. But I think just to be sensitive to what do you need, and not to be afraid to be, as I say, a little bit selfish during that time, and to reach for that.
And I think it's important too, like you mentioned, grief is a spiral more than I think we hear about, the stages of grief. And when we think of stages, it's like, okay, stage one, stage two, you just move along the path and you're like changing to the next level, the next level. But then a lot of people become dismayed because they find themselves going back. They're back in a stage they thought they were through. And I think it's important to remember it's not step one, step two, step three. You will continue to go through that. But like you said, the time in between feeling that it might change. Do you get a lot of people that come to you, especially in your pastoral work, who want to know, why am I not going through the stages properly or anything like that?
I get some of that, but I think more and more people are realizing that, and I mean, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who talked about the stages in her groundbreaking research that she had done, she said it was never meant to mean you had to go through all of them or you had to go through them in order. And I think in her later work, she talks about that. And so some are aware that it's not these are the stages that you must go through and then you're going to come to the end of it. So I don't get as much people asking about the stages, but more generally, how to move forward and how to be unstuck in life. And in Hope Beyond Our Sorrows, I talk about my informal understanding of stages, just born out of my experience. There's that early stage of being plunged into molasses and can't move, and then that middle stage of being struggling to get out of the molasses and doing all of those first things, the first anniversary of the death, the first birthday, the first Christmas, dealing with all of the sort of death work of transferring titles of things or closing bank accounts or credit cards or whatever it is. And then there's what I call present grief, which is it goes on and on. I know that someone had asked me at one point, I think my husband had died about 2 years ago, and someone had asked me, how did you deal with your grief? And just the way they said it, I thought, yeah, they're talking about the grief as if it's past. But I right away translated it into my own mind. How am I dealing with grief? Because for me, I'm at this point of now 3 years since my husband's death. I would say, yeah, there is still that sense of grief that is with me now. I would not say I've dealt with it in the past and now I don't have it. I would say I dealt with it that way before, and maybe I'm dealing with it, living with it differently now, but it's still that present grief. And it's been 3 years, maybe in another 10 years or 20 years or whatever, I might think of it differently again. But that's as far as I know from my experience now.
Would you say there were small, unexpected moments of, perhaps joy or comfort that helped you keep going during those initial first weeks and months?
Definitely, like so many unexpected blessings. Even that night after my husband had died in the hospital, and it had been so sudden, I hadn't called anybody. I mean, I just was driving home and it was raining, and I drove up and I could see at the front door there was a vase of daffodils. And I thought, who would bring me flowers? I hadn't told anyone. And I saw that there was a card with it, and it was left by two of my friends who knew that I would be at the hospital that day, and they had just left flowers to say, we're thinking about you. And that to me was such a sign already. I'm not as alone as I might think I am. God is with me, friends are with me. The church had been praying for us faithfully every week and more. My sisters, my other family members, I was surrounded by a whole company of people. And that, even early on, was a sign to me. We did not have a funeral service. It was, as I say, coming out of COVID, and people right away on the one hand would say it's COVID. If you have a service, we won't be coming. And on the other hand, some people were saying COVID's just over. We already have travel plans, so we won't be coming. And my husband had never cared to have a funeral service. His brother said, do whatever Gary and you would want. And so instead of having a service, there was an online memorial with so many very touching things that people wrote. I received so many cards, even from our realtor who had helped us buy our home. And I hadn't talked to him for over 10 years, but he had seen the notice in the newspaper and wrote a card to me. So many of those blessings along the way were very, very important to me. And I, one reason why I answered every card, one of my friends said, you don't have to answer every card in every email. People are not expecting that. And I said, I think like, I want to do this. And I think even more because we didn't have a funeral where people could come and I could talk with them. It just felt right and good for me to answer all of them. I mean, I it took me a year because there were so many, but I was glad to do that.
That's amazing. Now, on that note of people sending cards and things, what would you say is I know a lot of people are kind of unsure of how to approach somebody when they are going through grief. And in those moments when people are unsure, sometimes they might say some unhelpful things or just not know what to do and maybe stay away. What advice would you give to the friend or family member who wants to come alongside their person who is grieving and they're just not sure the right way to do it?
It's okay to not be sure, yet still, I think there's value in expressing your care and in being present. I've always taken my cues in ministry and in life personally, taking the cues from the other person. So for some people, I know that they because I know them personally, I know the kinds of things that they would respond to or not respond to. So for some people, they would just love to have a whole house full all the time and to really be there in that way. Others prefer to get a card or a phone call or an offer to get together at some time and plan it out ahead of time, whereas others people don't mind just someone dropping by. So I tend to be very contextual like that myself. But even if you don't know, don't let that stop you from somehow expressing care. I know for myself, I've had some conversations where people have asked some very personal questions that would be awkward. And I sometimes think, how can you ask this? We should know one another much better for me to have this conversation with you. But I realize how much it comes out of people's own concerns too. So the person who is concerned about their family member who is dying maybe asks me, well, was it painful? Because not so much that they even really want to know my experience, but they're thinking about their own experience and wanting to think about the person that they love who is going through this. So I think, we can have grace for one another even when we don't know exactly the best way to respond.
Yes, definitely. And understanding that people are approaching out of care and concern and maybe just aren't sure what to say. And so sometimes in those moments we all sometimes say some crazy stuff.
Well, that's right. And it's okay to say, I'm not sure the best way to show you how much I care about what you're going through, but I want you to know that.
Yeah, I love that. Then that person can tell you actually, I would prefer to have people come over or I would prefer to talk on the phone. They can let you know then what it is that they personally need.
That's right. And, the other part of that is sometimes the person themselves, they don't know either. And that's
Right.
okay. And it may change from day to day or moment to moment what they even think they want. And it's okay to just let that be too.
Now, would you say that through this process your faith changed at all?
Know if I would say my faith changed when my husband was diagnosed this second time with cancer. He had a sudden emergency at home and was actually then diagnosed with kidney failure. And it was out of that they discovered the cancer had recurred. But because it was an emergency situation, and I remember my first thought was, make haste to help us, O God. It actually comes from one of the Psalms. That became my prayer. And I would say from when that happened, that's when my faith really, really deepened because it just seemed like such a desperate situation that we could not do anything about ourselves. That was during COVID when I couldn't even be in the hospital with him
Wow.
when he was first diagnosed. So, yeah, it was make haste to help us, oh God. That was my prayer over and over. So I think that was the point where I would say my faith really deepened. And then for the long haul of what we thought was recovery, and then this sudden plunge into molasses. But through all of that time, that deepening sense of my need for God in a different way than perhaps I had thought about it in the past.
Now, for someone listening who is freshly grieving, what are some of those like day to day kind of practical things that, and obviously everyone's different, but what are some of those things that helped you to get through the day to day stuff that kind of felt impossible at the time?
Well, for me, what helped was to figure out what really needed to be done and what could be left. Like, I know for some people, it's very important for them to do all of the practical sort of changing the names of things and, dealing with the house and the car and the all of the physical things of life. I didn't do that. I've thought to myself, well, what really needs to be done now? And actually, the answer is none of those things. So I did give myself a lot of grace and time. And I would still say, even now, there are some things that 3 years later, some people would have done immediately within the first week or two in terms of dealing with some of the practicalities when someone dies. Whereas I thought, yeah, I don't really need to do that. And in fact, it was only maybe it was last year, I finally called in to change the name on our electric bill from my husband's name to my name. And the person said on the other line, well, we can't send a bill to a deceased person. But actually, they had been all that time because the bills came in by email. I paid them from our joint account. I was still getting them by email and paying them from the account. I was just getting the name changed, though. And I said to her, I realize I probably should have called in earlier, but I'm grateful that you're helping me with this now. So for some people, it would have been very important to do that immediately. For me, I left it for a couple of years because I didn't see it as necessary and I was working on some other things personally. So yeah, I think it varies quite a bit on what might be most helpful. For some people, it's important to do all of those things right away. And sometimes people have to. I know some friends after a parent died, they really did have to move out of where she had been living and they had to do it fairly quickly. So sometimes circumstances force you to do those things, but sometimes they don't. And then I would just say give yourself time to do that. And also to know that I hope people have someone that they can reach out to in their family or among their friends or at their church who can also be with them if they would like that. I mean, I have one friend who said, if you want me to go with you to the bank or to the wherever, she said, I'd be happy to do that with you.
Well, that's really nice. Yeah, and if you don't have somebody like that, ask somebody that you're close to. If nobody's necessarily offered, I think you could ask a friend or a close, family member and just say, "Hey, I could really use some support here."
Yeah, well, I hope people have someone like that in their life that they can turn to and that they can ask. And there are also social supports too in the community if someone feels like they don't really have anyone that they can ask. I know in our area, there's community services that can also be helpful.
Yes, definitely. Or, at your church, you may find some resources there as well. Now, when you imagine your readers sitting down holding your book, what do you picture as far as what you want them to know as they read your words?
I've had some very interesting responses from readers already that give me pause when you ask that question. One person said to me, she started reading my book and her husband just died within the last year, well, within the last 8 months or so. And she said, I read and then I start crying, so I have to stop reading. And then sometime later, I go back and I read until I start crying, and then I have to stop reading again. One person said to me, I have your book, but I'm afraid to read it because I'm afraid of going through that kind of loss myself. Another person contacted me and she said, I've read your book and my situation is very different. I'm caring for my husband and it's not the same situation, I know, she said, but I feel like you understand this idea of loss is stacking up one after another, she said, because that's how I feel. So when I hear from readers like that, I think, I just want to embrace all of them and say, if what you read it makes you cry and you want to take a break and come back to it later, blessings on you. And I hope those tears are healing and are helpful as part of your grief journey. And to the person who is afraid to read, no pressure to read it now. Maybe it's not the right time for that. Maybe it is. Maybe you just want to open it at random and read a paragraph and see what you think because it's written in short sections so a person can do that. Or maybe you just want to look through the table of contents and there's a title there that catches you. And so maybe you'll start there. You don't have to read it from beginning to end. And to the person who is dealing with a different kind of grief, I hope that they will be able to read this book and have a sense of being accompanied in that, even though their grief and their journey is very different. I appreciate what Helen Keller said about those who are suffering. We're part of the greatest company in the world. And there is some sense of community, I hope, even when it comes to reading a book.
Now, in wrapping up, I know we've talked about a lot of heavy things, but what are some things right now that you're hopeful for, bringing you joy? What's the next chapter for you?
When my editor asked if I was ready to write another book and could it be on my grief journey, or her other idea was maybe I could write on pastoral burnout because I've done some speaking on that too. I wasn't sure if I could write another book or wanted to write another book. But as I've been working on this and seeing it published, as I've been doing some further reading for myself, I'm actually starting to collect things for another future book. So for me, that seems like a change within the last year that I'm thinking that, yeah, not only have I written a book, maybe I could write another book. I've been doing a lot of other writing and editing too. So in some ways it's been very busy and I don't find myself, as in writing Hope Beyond Our Sorrows, I sometimes did just take a break and lie on the couch and do a crossword puzzle because it was just so intense. And I find myself having to do that not as often. I mean, I still love to do crossword puzzles and lie on the couch, but not necessarily as a break because it is too intense in the writing. So I think some of that has been opening up for me. And I think the other thing is I keep learning so many new things that I have never done before or that my husband always did and now I am needing to do. And so that's another, I think, stage for me. And it gives me kind of a sense of satisfaction because, in part, because I am doing these things, but in part because he would be so pleased. So, it seems small, but one day the dryer wouldn't work. Every time I tried to turn it on, it would just buzz as if it was finished. And so I looked online and I figured out what some people do is they take off the outer dial, they use a wrench to turn the inner mechanism so they at least can get to a drying cycle, and you can order a part and fix it yourself. And I saw the part online. I saw a video that showed how you can fix it in just a few minutes with only a flathead screwdriver. So I ordered the part and it took me more than a few minutes because I had to search for the flathead screwdriver. But I was able to do it myself. And I just thought, yeah, like I wouldn't have tried that probably before. I wouldn't have thought, oh yeah, I can look online and see a video and I can actually do that myself, and it worked. So, some of those things are, yeah, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of joy, a sense of satisfaction. And so I value those too.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much, April, for being here today. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk through your book and your grief journey. And I just know that it's going to bless a lot of our listeners today.
I'm so grateful for our conversation and being able to share some of my, kind of spontaneous thoughts with you. But I hope that there is something there that your listeners will be able to find helpful to them. I just, I pray for all those. And I sometimes do this in my own personal prayers. I pray for all those who are grieving, both here and around the world, people I know and people I don't know at all, that we might find a way forward, that God might bring comfort and peace and strength even as we grieve.
Thank you so much. April's book, Hope Beyond Our Sorrows, isn't just a book about loss. It's a book about faith that doesn't flinch, a book about learning to live again when it feels like life has stopped. So if you are carrying grief of your own or walking alongside someone who is, I hope April's story reminded you that sorrow and hope can coexist, that God can handle your questions, and that even in the pain, love never ends. You can find Hope Beyond Our Sorrows wherever books are sold, and you can connect with April and her beautiful writing at aprilyamasaki.com, and we will have that link in the show notes. As always, thank you so much for being here. Let's keep finding the diamonds together. Thanks for listening to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. If today reminded you that resilience is a practice, not a personality trait, you're in the right place. Keep showing up, keep rebuilding, and don't forget, even diamonds start as pressure and mess. For more faith-filled encouragement and real-life tools to help you heal and grow, check out the show notes for some free resources and ways to stay connected. See you next time.